In the late 1700s, the fledgling nation of America awoke to a startling reality. U.S. trade ships in the Mediterranean were being overrun by pirates who terrorized American crews, held them for ransom, even sold them into slavery. These outrages would lead to a little-known war. As we go in search of history for Pirates of the Barbary Coast. Northern Africa's sun-baked Barbary coast of Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Tripoli, now known as Libya, has been a pirate's haven for centuries. For the Barbary Coast buccaneers, most of them Muslim, the lucrative spoils of piracy were a mainstay of their nation's economies.
By the 1600s, it had evolved into virtually a business. It was a major source of income and support for the rulers of these four states. Basically, what they did was made a national policy of always being at war with somebody. Then you sold a piece. Sometimes sold it for a flat rate, sometimes for annual tribute, sometimes a combination of the two.
The Barbary pirates patrolled the waters of the Mediterranean, demanding tribute or ransom for safe passage. The hefty tributes helped to maintain local economies and prop up the regimes of leaders called pashas or deys.
For centuries, in the area of the Mediterranean world, these vassal states along the north coast of Africa facing the Mediterranean had it as their business to control the waters nearby their shores. They were, in a way, sort of early exponents of the 200-mile limit. They believed that if you sailed within their waters, which they defined as being pretty far out, you had to pay tribute.
Trade vessels from around the world were compelled to submit to these conditions in order to sail the Mediterranean waters without interference from pirates.
In most instances, the European nations, England, France, Sweden, Spain, Portugal, had over the years worked out an arrangement with the Barbary corsairs by which annual tribute was paid. And by that payment, they were buying an insurance policy that then allowed their vessels to sail through those waters unmolested.
The richer countries of the world didn't mind paying in order to keep the peace. Great Britain even hoped to bankrupt other nations by driving up the going price of tribute.
England and France could afford to pay off Algiers and then turn the Algerines onto their enemies. This was a way of keeping down their commercial competition. So there was a saying in England and in France and in Holland that if there were no Algiers, we would have to build one. Because Louis XIV is supposed to have said this because it benefited France to have Algiers capturing France's rivals. The British commercialmen were supposed to have said this because it benefited England, and Dutch merchants also were supposed to have said this. These countries could afford to pay a large tribute because they did so much business in the Mediterranean.
But by the late 1700s, there was a new presence on the international scene, the United States of America. The young and hungry Federation of States was eager to trade with the nations of the world. But the upstart country was in for a rude awakening when its merchant ships arrived on the Barbary Coast.
As long as the American colonies were part of the British Empire, we were protected by the Royal Navy, and we were covered under that umbrella insurance policy. After independence, though, after 1783, we were no longer part of the British Empire. And now, as an independent nation, we, the United States of America, had to deal with the Barbary states.
The problem during the 1780s is the government doesn't have enough money to either bribe them or to build a navy and fight them.
The Barbary buccaneers had an uncomplicated strategy for their business of piracy. They often simply waited for ships to enter the Mediterranean Sea, then sailed alongside them.
And what the Barbary corsairs did is they set up a toll gate, and you paid at the toll gate. If you paid and went through the toll gate, then everything would be just fine. If you didn't pay at the toll gate, then they would attack and capture you and hold you for ransom, hold you and make you, force you to pay tribute.
The consequences of being taken prisoner were far worse for some seafarers than others. The pirates instituted a class system for their hostages.
How you treated these captives depended on who they were. If they were a captain or a passenger or an officer, you would often give them basically the freedom of the city. Now, if you weren't someone like this, you were in rags, and generally they kept you chained together. Sometimes they'd chain 2, 3, 4 people together. Sometimes they'd chain you individually to a heavy weight.
The American prisoners were put to work building fortifications for Algerian cities. With their fate contingent on whether ransom would be paid, some died from disease or malnutrition while waiting for American intervention. Ships from the embattled United States soon became known as easy prey for the Barbary Coast pirates.
The United States was born into a very hostile world. No one wished us well. Certainly the English didn't wish us well. They weren't good losers. The French had been our allies during the Revolution, but now they were our rivals. And certainly the Barbary corsairs did not wish us well either. We had virtually no defense for our trade. We had no navy.
A number of Americans were already enslaved at hard labor in Algerian prisons. Its reputation and expansion threatened, the young America faced a dilemma. Would it follow in the tradition of other world powers and pay tribute to the Barbary Coast pirates, buying freedom for those captured? Or would its political leaders challenge the stranglehold of the Mediterranean corsairs? By 1785, more than 20 American sailors were captives in Algerian prisons. President George Washington sent emissaries to the Mediterranean to discuss ransom arrangements. But America couldn't leave behind any fighting ships to ensure continuing peace. Washington was more concerned about the outbreak of war between the French and the British, which he saw as a greater danger to U.S. interests.
President Washington had a lot of other problems other than the 24 American sailors in Algiers. He appointed Jefferson to be Secretary of State, and one of the first things Jefferson did was to draw up a report on Mediterranean trade. And Jefferson said there are essentially 3 things the United States can do to secure peace and trade in the Mediterranean. 1, pay tribute to Algiers, Tripoli, and Tunis. 2, leave the Mediterranean altogether. Or 3, build a navy to subdue the Algerians, the Tripolitans, and the Tunisians.
Jefferson's findings received a decidedly mixed reaction from government leaders in Washington. Nobody was eager to engage in a war on the other side of the world simply to ensure trouble-free trading.
The ultimate goal is free and safe passage through their waters. We need to be able to sail through those waters in order to do business. And that is fundamental. We need to be trading in the Mediterranean. And the Barbary corsairs are an obstacle to trade. This is not an issue of imperialism. This is not an issue of conquering territory. This is a matter of business, commerce, and trade.
Still, the Barbary states plundered and pillaged at will. This enraged Jefferson, who took a much harder line than Washington. Though he was opposed to funding a large navy, Jefferson recognized the threat the Barbary corsairs posed to America's tenuous standing as an emerging world power. In his opinion, something had to be done. But still, America's political leaders hesitated.
And it wasn't until finally, in 1794, when it grew so worrisome, when the problem could no longer be ignored, that President Washington managed to persuade the Congress to authorize the construction of 6 frigates, 6 large sailing warships.
It didn't seem like much at the time, but the new legislation marked the birth of the United States Navy. The landmark legislation passed over the objections of Jefferson and other Republicans who saw it as a violation of states' rights. But a compromise was found to placate Jefferson and other Southern politicians. If peace was achieved with Algiers, only 3 ships would be built. Just 1 year later, Algiers signed a treaty and hostilities were suspended. As a result, the U.S. Navy began very humbly with just 3 vessels.
They became the first vessels in the new American Navy. The most famous is USS Constitution. She was launched in Boston in October of 1797. Commissioned in Boston, still afloat, oldest commissioned warship in the world.
The following year, John Adams defeated Thomas Jefferson in the race to become the 2nd President of the United States. Jefferson was named Vice President, but the 2 men clashed over the issue of whether to pay ransom to the Barbary corsairs.
You've got Adams saying, you know, it's a matter of trade, it's a matter of doing business. Pay the money and let's get on with business. You got Jefferson saying it's a matter of honor. American people want justice, and if we demand justice and respect for the United States, we'll gain stature in Europe's eyes.
Piracy again plagued American merchant ships in the Mediterranean, and the Barbary pirates seemed emboldened by America's failure to respond. By the time Thomas Jefferson won the presidency in 1800, he realized that bribes to Barbary states totaled over $2 million, more than 1/5 the total income of the U.S. government to that date. Yet the president, who had advocated the use of force while holding lower offices, seemed to turn gun-shy.
Back in the 1780s, Jefferson had said we need to fight them. But when Jefferson comes into office, Jefferson is more interested in balancing the budget, reducing the national debt, and he makes drastic cuts in the Navy. And he tries to negotiate with these corsairs, and he is willing to pay them off at this point, but the price is simply too high.
Yusuf, the cunning and mercurial Pasha of Tripoli, soon forced Jefferson's hand. In the spring of 1801, the greedy Yusuf demanded outrageous tributes from the U.S. When America declined payment, he chopped down the flag in front of the American consulate.
Things really began to heat up with Tripoli in 1801, and they really began to torment us and annoy us in ways and to a degree of seriousness that hadn't been achieved before.
Cutting down the American flag was a declaration of war, and America reacted accordingly. Jefferson ordered a squadron of 4 ships already in the Mediterranean to attempt a military blockade. The fleet was too small, and the effort was a dismal failure. To make matters worse, America's best fighting ship, the Philadelphia, ran aground